Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And boy, do we have a lot of news to talk about. An assassination in Japan of a former prime minister, a resignation of a current prime minister in Britain, meetings in Bali of the G20, and Xi Jinping celebrating 25 years of Hong Kong being part of China, and of course, an upcoming trip to the Middle East by President Biden. No one better to talk about all of this than our three guests today. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Nahal Toosi, senior foreign affairs correspondent at Politico. Nahal, great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
And also from Washington, D.C., Karen DeYoung, who is senior national security correspondent and associate editor at the Washington Post. Karen, great to have you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
And from New York City, Bobby Ghosh, who is a columnist at Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, great to have you back as well.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the really shocking, I think, news of the assassination of former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who is the longest-serving post-war Prime Minister of Japan, campaigning on the street as Japanese politicians do, and shot at point-blank range last night in Japan. Really shocking. Bobby, you had an opportunity to talk to him when he was still a younger politician. Reflect on both what happened in Japan 2 days, I guess, before an election this Sunday, and the man himself.
Yeah, I met him in the mid-1990s, I think 1996 or early 97 it was. He was then, I think, he had just finished his first term in the Japanese parliament in the lower house, but he was already marked for greatness. I mean, he was introduced to us as somebody who would one day be the prime minister of Japan. His maternal grandfather had been the prime minister, his maternal granduncle had been prime minister, his father had been in parliament, his paternal grandfather had been in parliament. So he came from the Japanese political aristocracy. He struck me then as being very smooth, very slick, almost like a Western-style politician at a time when Japanese politicians were much more stodgy, much more formal. But of course, at that time, I would not have guessed that he would become this towering figure that he became, and he did. And I was reflecting this morning when I woke up to the news that in my adult lifetime, I would suggest that he was the most consequential politician for his country and his region of any politician that I've ever encountered or covered in any meaningful way. I think more consequential than Angela Merkel, certainly more consequential than Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Tony Blair. I think he set his country in a new direction. His schemes and vision for his country didn't always come off, but he turned the direction in which the country was going. And I can't imagine that anybody would now try to turn the country back to where it was heading when Shinzo Abe took over. He had interesting ideas. He was willing to break with the Japanese tradition on how to manage the economy. He was far more forward-leaning in foreign policy, more aggressive. He spotted the challenge of China, the security, the geopolitical challenge of China, and articulated it long before anybody else, but at a time when Western politicians were still, at least rhetorically, pretending that China, because we had embraced China into the World Trade Organization, that China was going to become a kinder, gentler nation. Shinzo Abe was sounding warnings that was not going to be the case. Very controversial. He was, like many Japanese leaders are, he was negationist on Japan's role in the Second World War. Its colonial history. He tried to elide some of the things that Japan did, particularly in Korea. But I would argue a towering figure at a time when more and more politicians are shrinking in the public eye.
And importantly, Bobby, a towering figure, even though he had resigned as prime minister for health reasons, and yet was still sort of the dominant behind the scene leader behind Kishida, who's the current prime minister, who was his foreign minister in the last cabinet, really unable to get out of a shadow, and of course that shadow is now as large as it possibly can be. Nahal, your reflection on Abe. He of course was prime minister during a very tumultuous time in U.S.-Japanese relations. In fact, U.S. relations with everybody in the world when Donald Trump was president, and seemed to handle this really skillfully.
Yeah, he was one of the first, possibly the first world leader to connect with Trump after he'd been elected. He kind of went out of his way to have this connection to this very unpredictable new president-elect. And the two genuinely seemed to get along on a lot of levels. They played golf together. Abe really knew how to, push the right buttons when it came to Trump. And that involved, a certain level of sucking up and just, basically doing what he could. Now, I will say that, I don't know that I never got the sense that Abe got everything he wanted from Trump. I mean, he didn't get what he wanted on tariffs, things like that. So, I mean, at the end of the day, Trump did not necessarily treat him, any more special than many other world leaders. But, clearly Trump did respect him. Today, Trump actually put out a statement mourning his death, saying it was, in capital letters, bad news for the whole world. But then he called Abe a unifier, said he was a great man. It was a very, actually very strong and kind statement about this, about the former prime minister. And it was really interesting. It just made me wonder, if, the political assassination thing, this is not the first one we've seen in the last year or so. I mean, there was the Haitian assassination. There's just more. I don't know, look, if there's a study that measures this stuff or not, I'm not sure, but it feels like political violence is something that we're just seeing more of. It just feels a little bit more real. And it just, I don't know, you kind of wonder, what that means for the future.
Karen, your reflections. Bobby called him the most consequential leader of a democratic country in his adult lifetime. He was the man who coined the phrase "a free and open Indo-Pacific," which has now become sort of the leitmotif of American engagement in Asia. In many ways, he was also central to the formation of the Quad in the region. How do you reflect on him?
Well, I think it's important to note that not only was he prime minister through most of the Trump administration, he also was through virtually all of the Obama administration. And I think that he, as Bobby said, he was the closest thing to a Western politician, at least in his manner and his sometimes outspokenness, I think, that we've seen in the kind of, post-war era. In Japanese democracy. He was, his party's pretty far to the right. He's pretty far to the right. I think what he's remembered for, among other things, is that he really wanted to change the pacifist constitution in Japan and be a lot tougher on China. So I think that those are things he'll be remembered for. He really sort of brought Japan kind of finally out of the sort of post-war kind of, we're going to take a back seat. So I think that's important to remember about him. I mean, a lot of people didn't like him, although a lot of people did like him. He was thought of, he was not for women's rights. He, as you said, was non-apologetic about a lot of Japan's behavior during the war, and just a sort of out front kind of guy that we were not used to from Japan and haven't seen since.
Yeah, and the question, I guess, for the future of Japan, and we will be watching this, was he a unique figure, or are others now going to follow, not only in his policy footsteps, which I think Bobby rightly says is happening, but also in the mannerism of of how he campaigns. It worked in Japan, but it may have also been pretty unique to the man
I
himself.
think also it'll redound a little bit in the gun debate in this country. I mean, this guy, Japan has some of the strictest gun laws in the world. The police have said that this guy used what they described as homemade gun. I'm not quite sure what that means. And there's a lot we still don't know about it. But I think on both sides of the gun debate here, it will have some resonance.
Well,
can I jump in on
yeah.
about political assassinations? I think it's fair to say that although he was not a sitting prime minister, in the social media age, he's the most important figure to have been assassinated on live camera, so to speak. There are already videos out there on Twitter showing multiple angles, almost Rashomon, like showing, just people were holding up cameras and they captured the moment. That is quite something. I can't think of another leader. You could think of Reagan when that assassination attempt was made. That was also captured, I think, at least on still camera. We've never seen this before, and that is something that will take a little bit of processing, but will certainly be part of conversations not only in Japan, precisely because it was captured and has gone around the world. It'll be part of conversations everywhere about security, about whether this connection that Japan was practically the last major country in the world where a politician of his stature could stand in the corner of a street and address a small gathering with next to no visible security. That may no longer be possible. And we saw what the assassination of Olof Palme did in all the Nordic countries, where security is now far more cautious than it used to be. I think this may be the last of the democracies in which that direct, physical, tactile connection between the politician and the public existed, and I think it's now gone.
Yeah, at least leading politicians, for sure. Bobby, let's talk about another prime minister who was not shot, or maybe he shot himself in the feet. Boris Johnson, who didn't apparently learn the lesson from Donald Trump, that is, you never apologize, you just go through. But he lost half of his government, who wanted nothing to do with him anymore, and finally has decided that he is stepping down. A short-lived tenure, but certainly tumultuous for the country, at the very least, and for relations with much of the rest of the world. Boris Johnson, how will he be remembered, and what's going to happen next?
He will be remembered as this peculiar figure, which is basically how he has been known throughout his adult life. I think first as a journalist, and then as a television figure, then mayor of London. Boris Johnson, the first thing that strikes people about Boris Johnson is that he's odd. He's not at all like any other politician anywhere, I would suggest, not just in Britain, but anywhere. He will be remembered for delivering on Brexit with all the pain that it brought. He will be remembered, I think, for being slow on the uptake with COVID, but then responding very well. I think Britain did quite well once it got its act together with COVID. But he will be remembered for being economical with the truth, shall we say, for his lack of discipline, his appetite for recklessness, his disregard of rules, his lack of touch with oftentimes with reality around him. I lived in London when he became prime minister, and for the first couple of years thereafter, he had been genuinely popular. He had, let's not forget, only 3 years ago, led his party to a thumping majority victory in Britain. And his reputation was known well before that. So Britons knew who they were voting for, knew who they had elected, but came to realize once he became prime minister that he was clearly didn't have the character for the job. And the things that they found amusing when he was on television as a game show host, or when he was mayor of London, those things were no longer funny when he had become prime minister.
I think it's the Economist cover today has the famous picture of Boris Johnson gliding over the Thames what was it, the 2012 Olympics when he was mayor.
The zip line.
The zip line, and so there he goes. Them's are the breaks, as he put it. Karen, you and I met in London a long time ago.
A different conservative leader.
different conservative leader who lasted a little longer and is probably better. Will be remembered, Margaret Thatcher, for a longer time. But reflect on Boris. I've always thought that his hair just showed everything about who he was, but maybe not.
Well, I mean, I always thought you could look at his hair two ways. One, gosh, he just didn't care about it. And two, he cared very much about it, that it was a very stylized mess. And that said something about it. I think one of the interesting responses is the one that came out of the White House, a statement that basically said, never even mentioned him, said, well, we hope our long and strong relationship with Britain continues, and we're really together on Ukraine, and that's important. So let's get on with it. I don't think there was a lot of love lost with Biden. They're very different characters, and among the things that Johnson had said, he was sort of mouthed off a lot of times in a cleverer way than Donald Trump, but certainly in the same sort of genre, calling people names and particularly Democrats, both Hillary Clinton and Obama at various times before he was prime minister. I don't think they were close. I think they had a good working relationship. Obviously, Ukraine has brought Britain and the United States together. But I don't think anyone here is thinking, "Oh gosh, this is gonna really undermine this important foreign policy partnership."
No, I think you're right. I was struck by the same thing. To put out a statement that doesn't mention the person who's resigning is pretty remarkable. Nahal, I clearly the White House and I assume the State Department is looking towards the future, hoping that a more congenial person will take over, and perhaps there'll be more to be done. But in the meantime, Brexit is Brexit. It's happened. The situation is the situation. How do you think the U.S. is looking at the relationship going forward and what they hope to get out of it?
Yeah, I wrote a story about this whole issue yesterday, and the headline that I suggested to my editor was "Biden on Boris." Who? But my editors were like, we think that might go a little too far. But no, honestly, when I talk to folks, and this has always been the case when it comes to the UK and the US, when you talk about the relationship, whether it's under Trump or Boris or anyone else who might be erratic or whatever at the top, people just say that the foundations are so strong, that the linkages are so strong, that we're in such sync, especially when it comes to the security relationship. But not just that, that it doesn't really matter necessarily who's in charge. The systems just work really well together. And so this, again, it's not that there's no damage that can be done, and a determined leader could, of course, do some damage, but we need the Brits on so many things, from intelligence and other elements, that it just would be unwise to try to do something that would severely undermine that relationship. And so I think it's going to go on without a beat. I think the fact that Biden put out this statement and that didn't mention Boris pretty much tells you all you need to know, that it's like, okay, who's next? Who's the next prime minister? What's also fascinating to me about it is that, given, the parallels between Trump and Boris Johnson, the types of figures they were, although look, with Johnson, a lot of it was a shtick. He was known to intentionally muss up his hair. He was known to have said that you have to be kind of funny so that people remember you. I mean, a lot of this was an act, and he's a very intelligent guy. But the parallels between the two are fascinating, especially when it comes to their parties, right? I mean, the Conservative Party, they tolerated Boris for a while, but then they just the lies became too much. The ministers said, we can't go out there and repeat your lies and defend you. It is affecting our integrity. I mean, they turned on him. They kicked him out. That is not what has happened with Trump and the Republican Party. The Republican Party has stood by Trump despite many more scandals, 2 impeachments, egregious lies. It's really, really fascinating, the difference between those two political institutions. And, the conservatives of Britain are much more moderate than the Republicans of America, but still the parallels are really, really extraordinary.
Can I just say that statement where Boris Johnson is not named, I think that's very poor form, extremely poor form. The man was an elected prime minister of the most important country in America's foreign policy worldview. He was pro-American, whatever his personal foibles. The very least the president of the United States could have done is recognized who he was. I think that was very, very poor form. That's if it's meant to be a dig, it's the sort of dig. It's very juvenile and unbecoming of the president of the United States.
It's kind of those statements that you put in the draft folder. You write, put in the draft folder, then come back with it. No, point well taken, Bobby. I think that's the reality is the reality is.
I also think, as was alluded to, we have to point out that the British and American political systems are very different. That Boris Johnson was not so much elected prime minister. He's the leader of the party. He represents a constituency like every other member of parliament in Britain, and he was chosen by the party as its leader. And the fact that they're not going to have another election, the Conservative Party is just going to choose another leader. I think is something that can't happen here because of the way we have a direct election of president, and it's a very different sort of system.
But there's also that old saying that political parties are not suicide pacts, and it's worth keeping that in mind as well.
Yeah, no, I think the political system. I think the political system differences explains in part of it of why Boris's demise happened in a way that it couldn't.
Yeah, and it's not an unheard of thing in Britain. I mean, it's happened a number of times before.
In fact, it has happened to
his predecessor.
I guess 2 out of the last 4 predecessors, both
right.
Theresa May and Margaret Thatcher.
Right.
Cameron resigned, of course, after the Brexit fiasco. The fiasco being the referendum itself. One last point, I think it is important to point out that Johnson did push the constitutional limits inside Britain on a whole variety of things, proroguing government, the parliament, telling the parliament to go home so he could act without it, trying to and of course, right now, failing to resign as prime minister, even though he is stepping down as leader of the Conservative Party. It's a country without a constitution, at least not a written one, which where norms and customs are very important for the system to work. And ultimately, even though he pushed the boundaries, he didn't break them. And we'll see where this leads. Let's shift over, Karen, to another part of the world, back to Asia. Last week, the president of China, the head of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, visited Hong Kong to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the end of British rule in Hong Kong. But Xi didn't use this as just as a celebration of that fact. He also made very clear that the Hong Kong of today is a very different place than the Hong Kong of even a few years ago, let alone 25 years ago. A major statement of change. tell us what happened and what it really means for China and the region.
Well, here's a head of government who is very firmly in power, unlike the one we were just talking about. This was in a sense a real victory lap for Xi. It's the first time he's left mainland China since COVID started. As you said, it marked the 25th anniversary of the handover from Britain to China. It also marked the third anniversary of the when China went in to squash the pro-democracy demonstrations in Hong Kong. And since then, democracy's gone farther and farther away from Hong Kong in what certainly the West says is a violation of the self-governing agreement for 50 years that was part of Britain's withdrawal. So he shows up there. Streets were empty, although it's hard to tell if that was because of COVID, because there are still some pretty strict quarantine restrictions in Hong Kong, or if it was because of security, which was very, very tight. And there were a lot of military, marches around and a lot of police presence, or if the pro-democracy movement really is just completely demoralized and pretty much dead in Hong Kong, which seems to be the case, at least in terms of activism in the streets. He was greeted by the new chief executive, who was a handpicked guy, not a politician, a guy who comes from the security services. And again, that was a sign that things are not going to change in Hong Kong, that Chinese rule is really firmly entrenched. They have a new security law that they put in place in 2020, very harsh penalties for dissent. We see a very different Hong Kong than it was 3 years ago in terms of the media. Free media has largely been shut down. In terms of the I don't know if they call it the parliament, but the ruling body, which theoretically had guaranteed seats for democracy proponents. Now it's pretty much the whole thing is handpicked by the Chinese government in Beijing. So I think that where they're going to see a problem, and she talked about how Hong Kong was going to continue to be an economic engine for China, but I think they're having real problems there. It was the center of operations in Asia for all kinds of Western countries. I read the other day, I think about half of them have pulled out of having Hong Kong as a headquarters. Inflation is high. He wants to, what she talked about during the visit was he wants to set up these technology and industrial centers in different parts of China and kind of assign big urban areas, big industrial areas, their role in building the Chinese economy. Hong Kong is supposed to do the tech side of that. It's not clear whether they're going to be able to do that. So I think it's still sort of up in the air, but it's a very, very different place, certainly with Beijing firmly in control, which is what he demonstrated at every stop there.
Now, I think Karen paints a picture of Hong Kong as fundamentally transformed from anybody who's been to Hong Kong, a financial dynamo of the region, a vibrancy that existed, and none of that seems to be part of it. And yet we don't hear a lot of people talking about this, particularly in the U.S. government. Yes, democracy's been snuffed out, but it's become a phrase in a long speech. It isn't clear how the U.S. or Western countries are reacting beyond having condemned it early on, and they're ready to move on. But in the meantime, 7 million people plus in Hong Kong who have been promised one country, two system, turn out it's just one country, one system in 25 years or 22 from the crackdown. How in your reporting in Washington, are people talking about Hong Kong, and if so, what do they think we should be doing about it?
So look, I can't say that I've spent a lot of time asking about it, but definitely is not one of those things that comes up in discussions, even when it comes to China-specific discussions that much. People are much more likely now to talk about Taiwan, where it's still independent. Well, I'm going to use the word independent very loosely there. Nobody freak out. But it's not anywhere near what Hong Kong has gone through. And yeah, I mean, I just think, look, it, you have U.S. officials from both political parties who always say, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? But the reality is, like, you only have so many resources, you only have so many people, you only have so much capacity, and some things are just going to get prioritized over others. And look, anything is possible because there could be things being done behind the scenes, classified, that we're not hearing about. But no, I don't see Hong Kong and its future as a priority for the U.S. outside of this idea of we need to counter China. I mean, it's just not, it's like so many other parts of the world now that is under a repressive government, that there's frankly very little that the United States can do besides just issue sanctions and make statements and just see if they can manage the crisis and limit the amount of harm that is done on human rights through primarily words. And so no, I mean, I will say this. So, we say like that she is firmly in charge, and that's certainly the impression that I get when I talk to Chinese officials. When I talk to Chinese officials, it's really striking to me how deferential they are to him, how defensive they are of him. They're like, look, he is stable, he is doing a good job. Why would we want your democratic system when there's constantly turnover and change and things are always chaotic? But we have this guy who seems to know what he's doing, and he's stable, and everything is secure. And they constantly bring up the issue of security. I mean, I counter with them. I'm like, look, yeah, you can make a city secure if you just get rid of all the people too. Like, this isn't this type of security, this type of firmness that she seems to have. I am not convinced that I think it is possible that it hides a lot of fragility, and that something could happen, some black swan event perhaps, or something else that exposes him as a Potemkin leader. Now, maybe I'm completely off, but I just, my sense is always that the more repressive that a leader is, the more insecure he feels. And again, I could be wrong, but we'll see.
I love that phrase, Potemkin leader. We'll look for that in Politico to appear, headline or not. Bobby, jump in, and one of the things I'd love you to comment on that Nahal said is the impact on Taiwan. Clearly, Taiwan, which is a vibrant democracy, the last thing they want is to think about that they will be the next Hong Kong. And by the way, shouldn't we be worried about that too?
Yeah, I feel a little bit like it's a Tom Hanks movie in which he intersects with the major events of the day, Forrest Gump, because I lived in Hong Kong for 8 years. I was there working as a journalist for the handover, and I remember the mood of the moment where there was quite a lot of optimism among people in Hong Kong that things would go well. They bought into this promise of one country, two systems. In fact, there was a fair amount of optimism that Hong Kong would change China rather than the other way around. There were very, very few, at least in the public square, there were very, very few people who were suggesting that the opposite would happen, which is, of course, how things have turned out. And so 25 years later, it is really quite shocking to look back and see how naive so many people were at the moment, and how much it perhaps is a reflection of what they wanted to believe, what they desperately needed to believe at that moment. And the Taiwanese point that you and Nahal made is very apropos, because the Taiwanese, part of the optimism about Hong Kong and the one country, two systems idea was that the mainland would need Hong Kong to remain independent as almost a lure for Taiwan, that they would be able to use the argument to bring China in from the Taiwan in from the cold. Look, we've let Hong Kong be. Hong Kong is thriving. Hong Kong hasn't become a more repressive place. Why shouldn't you join this very happy family? Well, that has long since gone out of the window. Xi Jinping clearly doesn't think he needs to mollycoddle the Taiwanese or try to sort of draw them in with any kind of carrots. Instead, he used the threats of stick. And so, it's not an exact parallel, but in some respects, the world's failure to really push back against these things in Hong Kong is what really frightens Taiwanese. I mean, a lot has been made during these past 6 months with the invasion in Ukraine about how that Russia's behavior in Ukraine might influence China and Taiwan, and how what lessons the Taiwanese are taking from the Ukrainian example. Okay, yes, but the Taiwanese are taking many, many more lessons from what happened in Hong Kong. And that's very, very important. And to some degree, in Taiwan, the feeling is that the world didn't step in or didn't put up any kind of serious resistance in Hong Kong. Maybe they won't help us when the time comes. So in that sort of fairly tortured analogy, Hong Kong is Crimea. And just as the world didn't do enough in Crimea and encouraged Putin to embark on his latest misadventure, that something similar may happen with China and Taiwan. So yes, the Taiwanese are watching very, very closely, not least because so many Taiwanese figures have got close connections with Hong Kong. They travel to Hong Kong all the time. Many, many Hong Kong Chinese people have, even in my personal network of friends, have in these past 3 or 4 years moved to Taipei and other parts of Taiwan. And so they're observing closely. They have sort of close connections with Hong Kong. And there's nothing that's happening in Hong Kong that allows for any kind of optimism.
I think there's what's underscores all of this was Xi Jinping's phrase that Hong Kong has risen from the ashes. If the Hong Kong before repression were the ashes, then I'm not sure what the future is. And I can bet you that the Taiwanese are paying attention to that. We just have a little more time to Nahal to switch to our last topic, which is looking ahead at Biden's trip next week to the Middle East. One wag I was talking to the other day said that if you look at Biden's policy towards the Middle East, it's actually not that different from Trump's. Is that a fair characterization?
It's very fair. It's very, very fair. I would I would expect some journalists to be writing stories about that in the coming days. Look, especially when it comes to Israel and the Saudis and this idea of basically putting aside the Palestinian issue and promoting what the Biden administration likes to call integration in the region. There's very much, it's a continuity. But here's the thing: some of it is intentional. Like the Biden administration sees genuine value in building on the Abraham Accords that have led to diplomatic normalization between Israel and a number of Arab countries. That's something I expect we'll see Biden talk about during his visit next week to Israel and Saudi Arabia. But there are other things in which the Trump administration basically handcuffed the Biden administration, right? So they closed down the U.S. consulate that dealt with the Palestinians. They reversed their legal determination on the Israeli settlements. The Trump administration basically said that they did not see the settlements as being inconsistent with international law. They did a number of these things and others that legislatively and legally are really difficult to reverse. Israel either won't give consent, or Congress has passed a law that's essentially codified these things. So there's a lot of cases where the Biden administration really has no choice, or it just feels like we just have to go along this path because there is not an obvious alternative. I think you're going to see a lot of continuity but they also have had, I should say, some wins. Yemen is more peaceful than it's been in 7 years because, thanks in part to the Biden administration, there is a truce right now that's holding. You are seeing these talks you are seeing between the two, Israel and these other countries. You're seeing them talk about a regional defense alliance, an air defense alliance. There are some political prisoners who have been freed. I mean, there are things happening, sometimes quietly, sometimes very openly, that the Biden administration feels like is testament to their desire to engage with the region, even as their goal is actually to have a better integration of Israel so that they can have a calmer Middle East, so that they can turn their focus toward Asia.
Karen, you see it the same way, and in some ways that both the strictures of the previous policies and the reality, I think, as Nahal rightly puts it, that what Biden and the administration want is to pay the least attention necessary to the Middle East, so they can pay attention everywhere else. And if that means going to Saudi Arabia, it means going to Saudi Arabia and not talking about the Palestinian issue. Or is there a genuine sense that, no, this is actually the right way to move it forward?
I'm not sure. I usually completely agree with Nahal. I'm not sure I totally do this time. Biden's going to meet with President Abbas, as well as with the new Israeli prime minister. He's going to give a lot of lip service to the two-state solution, which officially his government still believes in. I think they may announce some stuff that'll make the Palestinians happy. I think with Saudi Arabia, let's not forget this is a meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council, so you'll have all the Gulf countries there. Right now, the only bilateral that's scheduled is with the Saudis. What do they want from the Saudis? They want them to produce more oil, although that's going to be very difficult for the Saudis to agree to. But they also want the Saudis to step back from China. The Saudis have been making a lot of noises. The Chinese have been making a lot of noises. The Saudis are talking about, just as they did with Russia a couple of years ago, talking about buying to some Chinese defense equipment. The Chinese are going to theoretically build a drone factory for armed drones that the United States has not been willing to give Saudi Arabia. So I think that you can't totally separate it from Asia. At the same time, there's real concern about Iran. The Iran talks are going nowhere. They had this little blip a couple weeks ago where they resumed talks in Qatar, and it went nowhere. The trying to get a unified air defense system in the Gulf is nowhere near a new concept. I mean, I remember going there with Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, where she was making the same argument and didn't really get too far. So I think that, they would very much like to have a sort of hands-off relationship with Saudi Arabia. And they've sort of concluded that it's just not in U.S. security interests to do that because of Yemen, because of Iran, because of China, because of oil.
I just want to say for the record that I always 100% agree with Karen.
That's good. All right, Bobby, do you agree with both Nahal and Karen? You're a good student of the like they are of the region. How is the region looking at Biden in this trip? And we only have a minute or so left. So,
am I crazy? Of course, I agree with both. But because we only have a minute, I'll just zoom in on the one thing, which is this idea of a military cooperation. It's complete pie in the sky. Complete pie in the sky. All those Arab militaries are just not suited for any kind of military activity. These are militaries, despite the billions of dollars spent on fancy equipments, these are militaries that are designed and oriented towards beating up unarmed democracy protesters. They're not fit to fight a war. They're getting whooped by a bunch of poorly armed rebels in Yemen. Nobody should be under any illusion that they can carry any weight in any sort of regional collaboration. If the security of the region is important, then it will always fall to the United States and to some degree to Israel to carry most of the weight in any kind of alliance. I hope Biden isn't kidding himself on this. Whether it is the Saudis, the Emiratis, never mind the Kuwaitis, Omanis, and the others, none of them, not even the Egyptians, the biggest military in that part of the world, none of them have the actual ability to help out in any kind of security. This is not this idea of a Middle Eastern NATO. Remember that came up during the Trump administration. This is not a Middle Eastern NATO. At best, these Arab armies can provide a fig leaf of an impression of a consensus, but it's going to be American jets and Israeli jets that have to do most of the work.
Well, it might be a Middle Eastern NATO, but it requires the United States as the principal military actor, as is true in NATO as well. But point well taken, Bobby. And we will be watching, of course, what actually happens next week when Biden does travel to the Gulf and to Israel. In the meantime, really enlightening conversation this week. I want to thank Bobby Ghosh, Nahal Toosi, and Karen DeYoung for all of your insights. I want to thank everybody for joining, and we'll be back next week for another edition of World Review. Until then, bon weekend.